last few sessions, 10 minutes talk. Hazel is going to give you the 8-minute warning, and then there are 2 minutes for questions. And we start with Irina. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you.
There you are.
I hope you hear me well and see the screen.
Yes.
So together with the co-authors, I'm presenting the study on the carbon cycle response to temperature. And you haven't seen it? Okay, perfect. And the motivation of this study is based on the Paris Agreement temperature goal to limit the warming by 2 or maybe 1.5 degrees by the end of the 21st century. And we know, however, that there is a gap between what science tells us to do to reach this target and for the national policies for NDC, that there is a gap between them, and thus temperature overshoot, in other way, exceeding temperature of this 2-degree target, at least temporarily, is becoming more likely. And so because currently land and ocean are sinks of carbon from the atmosphere, we're interested of the response of them to this overshoot. And by overshoot, I will be talking not about only temperature overshoot, but also CO2 concentration overshoot, or going like ramping it up and down. And till now, I'm listing here several studies that have been already done on this topic. However, what we noticed is that the limitation we found in these studies is that it's difficult to compare them between each other because they use different models, different scenarios, often idealized. And also, usually study uses one model, or sometimes it's even of intermediate complexity. So we think such further study is needed. And so as a result, to explore the carbon cycle feedback over land and ocean on the overshoot scenario, we use a state-of-art SMHI system models listed here. And the overshoot scenario from also SMHI called SSP 534 overshoot. It comes from it branches from the SSP 585 scenario in the year 2040, as usual, till the 2040, when the severe mitigation starts via mainly biofuel crops expansion, and it causes negative emissions by the end of 21st century and going back to zero later on. And here, note that I'll be using CO2 concentration-driven scenario, not emission one. And in the next slide, I hope you see it, I'm showing the results on how, first, the input itself, the CO2 concentration changes. And if you look at the left figure, you can see the blue line that shows change of CO2 growth rate, and the black dashed line that shows change of CO2 concentration. And we can see that as the response of the mitigation efforts, there are 2 peaks of CO2 growth rate that happens almost immediately after the mitigation that lags for 2 decades. And Earth system models shown by different colors show quite a different response of temperature to these changes in CO2 concentration, but all the models agree that the temperature response is lagged after the CO2 concentration. And on the right side, we can see the changes in the ocean and land carbon uptake to the changes in CO2 and climate. And what we can conclude is that ocean and land continue to uptake carbon from the atmosphere till the very end of 21st century, and all the models agree on that, they become carbon source for limited time somewhere in the 22nd century before ramping back to zero, like weak sink state. Look at is that both ocean and land peak, ocean and land uptake peak earlier than CO2 concentration peak, somewhere right after the peak of CO2 growth rate. And we further looked at this peculiarity, and you can see as we plotted the change in the land and ocean uptake to the changes in the CO2 growth rate, and we found actually quite a nice dependency. So for the land it is somewhat weaker. It's a bit linear, but it's weaker probably also because of but for the ocean, we can see that the ocean uptake increases nearly linearly with the increase of CO2 growth rate, peaks somewhere in the very peak of CO2 growth rate, then shows a hysterical behavior. And again, there is almost linear dependency during the ramp back period. Ocean uptake becomes negative somewhere after 21st century, closing the cycle. This it seemed to be quite interesting. And for the land uptake, we explored further, and what we found is that the early peak of the land carbon uptake can be explained by two reasons. And first is the differences between gross primary production and terrestrial ecosystem respiration peaks. So it is known that GPP, of gross photosynthesis, has a stronger dependency on the CO2 concentration, and respiration has a strong dependency on the warming. So probably because of that, because CO2 concentration peaks earlier than warming, it means that GPP also peaks earlier than terrestrial ecosystem respiration that continues to increase. And that difference in the peaks causes the early land carbon uptake. And on the diagram on the right, you can see that it's indeed so. And if we look a bit further and decompose this respiration to two parts, plant respiration, autotrophic respiration, and heterotrophic respiration or soil decomposition, we can further see that probably soil decomposition makes this lag, but not all the models could show that this is the only reason, would be dominated by these reasons for the early land carbon uptake. And what we further found is that because in this SSP 534 overshoot scenario, the biofuel crops cause these negative emissions. There are lots of land use change emissions going on in 2040 to 2060 that also contribute to this early land carbon uptake peak.
2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And further, we decomposed to understand the changes further, we applied this carbon cycle feedback framework, where we used available biogeochemically and fully coupled simulations to decompose the changes of carbon from the pre-industrial change to the beta or carbon cycle, carbon concentration feedback contribution, and gamma or carbon climate feedback contribution. Bottom figures of land and ocean, you can see the solid lines that showing beta contribution and dashed lines negative gamma contributions. With land, beta uptake is overall dominating, is larger than gamma loss. And if we dig a bit further and look at the dependency of these parameters, beta and gamma, on the CO2 concentration change and temperature change, we can see that after the peak of CO2 and temperature, respectively, there is somewhat inertia on the feedback parameters, and then they amplify so that, as we can see, like take more carbon from the atmosphere via beta and lose more carbon via gamma. But as I stated earlier, that because beta contribution is overall larger, land and ocean continue to absorb carbon for continued time. And that ends my presentation. So I show that in the given scenario, the land and ocean continue to remove carbon for 50 years before turning to a source for a short time and then ramping back to a steady state. Then the ocean uptake decrease is due to dependency on the CO2 growth rate. And for the land uptake, it can be explained by the larger growth of respiration than GPP and land exchange emissions. And then inertia in beta and gamma after their peaks cause amplification of carbon cycle feedback parameters. But because beta contribution is larger, land and ocean continues to uptake carbon for a long time. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question from Chris Jones, and he's asking if the land hysteresis is really weaker than the ocean, because it looks like it might just be obscured by the interannual variability, and he's assuming you're plotting annual points. And smoothing out the variability might show the hysteresis loop better. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I understood the comment. I should probably check further. I didn't smooth the variability, but yeah, there is something to think on. But I don't think that the response will be that clear yet, because of also the intriguing land use change emissions in this scenario in particular.
Yeah.
But yes, this is something I should work on.
Then there's a second question from Victor, and he's asking what is more important, the forcing for land and ocean uptakes in the overshoot scenario, CO2 or climate? Did you hear me?
In the overshoot scenarios?
Yeah, if CO2 or climate is more important.
I believe in this overshoot that we looked at, SFP 534, yes, I think this is a problem with my connection. Sorry for that. Yes, I hope you hear me as well. So as I looked, this overshoot we considered is quite small compared to the previous existing studies. And like here, I believe beta is stronger. And I didn't show it here, but we also tried to look at the permafrost emissions and even including them, yet beta is stronger, but this is only because the temperature increase not as large.
Yeah, thank you. There is another question from Colin in the chat,
to look at the
and maybe you can
overshoots.
Yeah, maybe you can answer that question in the chat. Maybe we should move on. I think you did. We should move on for the sake of time. And next there is. Can you stop sharing, Irina? Or Hazel, can you make her stop sharing? Because next one is Ramón Fuentes Franco.
Yes, thank you. I will now start sharing.
Yeah.
Can you see it?
Yes, looks good.
Yeah, perfect.
I think I did.
Okay, so I will start now. I will be showing part of the recent work we have been carrying out here in SMHI. It's an ongoing work in which we assess the precipitation associated to ENSO, PNA and NAO in historical and future scenarios in CME6 models. In this work, we want to analyze the mean winter precipitation associated to El Niño Southern Oscillation, the Pacific North American pattern, and the North Atlantic Oscillation in historical and future scenarios, using, in this case, 3 coupled models, but the idea is to include more in the future. We analyze the impact of model resolution on the ENSO, PNA, and NAO relationship and their connection to precipitation in different regions that seem to have a teleconnection with these modes, or that are responding to these modes of variability. The models we are using are EC Earth, HAGEM, and CNRM. I'm showing in the right whether it's a change in atmospheric resolution or in both. In this case, EC Earth is the only model who has changes in atmospheric resolution, and HAGEM and CNRM have both changes in ocean and atmospheric resolution. The ensemble size, we're using those that are available in the ESGF. So for the case of the low resolution EC Earth is 3 ensemble members for the historical and SSP 5.8.5 scenario. EC Earth, the standard resolution, I will call it standard resolution, is 9 for the historical and 3 for the future. For both resolutions in HAGEM is 4 in the historical and future, and for CNRM we found 29 in the historical period and 6 for the future, and only 1 for the high resolution of CNRM. This work is partially motivated by a very interesting work by Faraday et al., in which they they see how CMIP-5 models show the relationship between the tropical precipitation over the Pacific in response to ENSO, and this how when you have intense precipitation connected to a positive phase of ENSO, you have a deepening of the Aleutian low. And these seem to be a negative correlation of 0.39, which doesn't seem to be a bit weakened in the future. However, for the when you have a deepening on the Aleutian low, generally the jet goes a bit southern, causing instabilities in the southern part of the northern Atlantic and having more likelihood of a negative NAO phase. So somehow there is a connection between positive phase of NAO and positive phase of PNA and a negative phase of NAO. So analyzing this for the CMIP-5 already gave some interesting results, but we wanted to connect it more to the response in the different regions that have connection to these modes of variability. So in this case, ENSO, we know that California, the Gulf of Mexico, Northern South America, East Africa, and the Middle East, Australia have a strong connection to ENSO. PNA, California, and the Gulf of Mexico, and with NAO, we analyzed only North Europe and Southern Europe. So with this, we want to go a bit forward, a bit beyond what they did, and trying to see whether the response in the precipitation has somehow a change in the future in the CMIP-6 models. As you can see, well, here I'm showing the mean power spectra across all ensemble members for the 3 models. There is a wide variety of ENSO flavors. All of them, well, all these historical simulations tend to reproduce the peaks, the main energetic peaks in the frequencies as Hadley SST, Hadley interpolated SST observations, with some problems, for example, in CNRM and the high resolution, which has a very weak ENSO in this case, and also showing less energy than the counterpart, than the core resolution counterpart. Not the case for EC Earth and HAGEM, in which they show similar peaks as the observations, and also similar between the core resolution and the high resolution. All of the models show an increase on the future ENSO compared to the historical ENSO, but this is not connected to the resolution. I mean, in some models is the high resolution, which is showing the greatest peak in the future, like is the case of EC Earth and HAGEM, but not the case for CNRM, which is the core resolution as in the historical period. And this is the regression. I'm showing here the regression as a percentage of the mean climatology for DJF precipitation for the historical period. I will not go in detail, but I want to show that in the upper part is the core resolution, in the middle is the high resolution or standard resolution, and then is the subtraction of the standard minus the cores. you can see that if we compare with ERA interim, all of them show features that are quite similar, but it's not so easy to have an assessment visually. That's why I will show you later, region by region. But I want to tell, well, I want you to make you notice that actually the intensity of the signal is a bit weaker in the high resolution compared to the coarse resolution. Well, and here I'm showing box plots of all the ensemble members of every model. Is the correlation between ENSO and PNA, the correlation between NAO and PNA, and NAO and ENSO for all the ensemble members. In yellow, you can see the historical, for the historical period from the last 50 years, and the SSP 8.5 for the last 50 years as well. You can see that there is a tendency of intensification of the ENSO PNA, except for HAGEM in the MM. Also, there is a stronger correlation, negative correlation between NAO and PNA and NAO and ENSO, in a systematic across all models and all ensemble members. The interquartile range moves according to the intensification, but it doesn't spread except for the HAGEM in between the PNA and ENSO. So the coarse model resolution also I'm showing with the arrows, the change that when you go from coarse to high resolution, there is still the intensification, but the intensification is weaker than in coarse resolution, as you have already noticed from the map of the regression. And now connecting to precipitation, we actually see the same response, not only among modes of variability, but also in the precipitation response connected to NAO. You can see there is a weaker intensification in the high resolution, but still is systematic across all the models. For Northern Europe, connecting to, having a stronger relationship with NAO in the future, and negative also more intense in the future for Southern Europe. And this is for ENSO and the different regions. You can see that for California, the Gulf of Mexico, and Australia, there is also a clear intensification of this relationship, but not for Eastern Africa, and it's not so clear also for Northern South America. So some remarks for the future power spectra. There is the main energy shows higher frequencies, a preference for higher frequencies compared to the historical simulations.
2 minutes.
Thank you. No consistent behavior due to different resolution across models. But regardless whether there is a lot of flavors in the change and the different kinds of ENSO the models reproduce, we find a stronger connection between ENSO, PNA, and NAO in the futures, and this is systematic across models in all resolutions. Although coarser resolutions show this relationship stronger than in finer or higher resolutions. So we want to expand this analysis for more models, but this is still an ongoing analysis. That's it in my case. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I don't see any questions in the chat, and I hope I didn't miss any because there's some chatter going on. But I have one. Yeah. Why are the correlation strengths dependent on resolution? Like I don't
that's a good question. Yeah, well, I think that it's like the coarse resolution you smooth the different patterns that you have at very high resolution in a region. This is one of the things we guess it might be the answer. We have to analyze better, but if you have a more defined topography, maybe the precipitation is noisier at high resolution.
Yeah. Okay. There is a question from Colin. Should we believe the high resolution models because they simulate gradients in the atmosphere and wave flow better now? Better? No.
Well, yeah, this is also an interesting question. If I didn't mention so much the comparison I was doing with ERA 5, but some high resolution models tend to show more similarities with ERA 5. So, yeah, it might be that, the features of the atmosphere are better simulated, but it's a very difficult question to answer.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Then we move on to the next talk, and this is by Bill Collins, and he's talking about chemistry and aerosol feedbacks in the CRESCENDO models. Ramón, yeah.
Hi, so hopefully you can to see that.
Yes, we do.
Good. So this is talking about feedbacks due to chemistry and aerosols in the CRESCENDO models. And there's a huge cast of contributors to this. Lots of people, the modelers, particularly for the various institutes, have contributed to this work. So why are we looking at this? So obviously a huge part of CRESCENDO was improving the representation and testing the representation of these new Earth system components. So one question is, does this make these models more or less sensitive to changes in forcing? So if you think here, we've got all these interactions that can form feedback loops. We've heard a lot about the carbon cycle feedback loops, where we heat the climate affects the carbon cycle, that affects the amount of carbon and so on. But I'm going to focus on ones involving chemistry particularly, although them go via ecosystems, so how the physical climate affects natural emissions, whether from vegetation or from dust, for instance, and then what that implies for the physical climate, and do these models have higher or lower climate sensitivity as a consequence. So the key ones I'm going to be looking at are the changes in natural emissions of changes in natural emissions of species such as dust, sea salt, DMS, BVOCs and so on, and changes due to chemistry. So here's looking at the aerosols. So we're looking at changes in emissions of aerosol species due to climate change. So here on the left, and I'll show quite a few plots like this. On the left-hand side, we've got changes in emissions of various species, and then on the right-hand side, we've got what that means in terms of radiative forcing for a doubling of emission, and then quantifying whether that gives us a positive feedback or a negative feedback. So just taking these sort of one at a time. Dust, we have very uncertain changes in emissions, but also the forcing from changing dust is small. There's some both positive and negative forcing from changing dust, so that actually doesn't affect the overall climate feedback. You can contrast this with something like sea salt, where we have large increases in sea salt emissions in a warmer climate, and these emissions also, the sea salt emissions also give us a large negative forcing. That means we have overall a large negative feedback. The DMS was once proposed in the Clore hypothesis as expecting that to increase in a warmer climate. It turns out it's not very obvious from this plot because of the difference in latitudes, but in this overall, on average, in the CRESCENDO models, we've got a slight decrease in DMS, particularly in the tropics. And so, although DMS does give you a negative forcing, that's a small positive feedback, not a negative feedback, as the Clore hypothesis said. We heard from Kat on Monday about BVOCs. Peter asked what is the overall feedback from that. So I've got a number at the end of this talk on what the overall feedback is from BVOCs. But there is a robust increase in all the models. They show that BVOCs over the forested regions of Amazon and Central Africa and the maritime continent all increase in a 4x CO2 world. And these emissions all tend to lead to a net negative forcing because they produce more aerosols. So you can see some blue patches here, coincident where the increase is in emissions of the BVOCs are. There are a few orange patches around, and that's due to ozone, but that's noticeably much more spread out. So BVOCs go on to produce ozone in the models. Here's just a zonal mean plot of the change in ozone due to increasing BVOCs. And that gives us a much more spread out positive forcing, but it's nothing like large enough to contribute to offset the negative forcing from BVOCs. And there's also an effect on the increase in methane lifetime that I will come back to later. Another one is lightning. So the lightning increased robustly in all the crescendo models, but we do have reason to think that's actually because they all use the same incorrect parameterization for lightning. But here we're just quantifying what the models do, not what they should do. And that gives us a small positive feedback. It produces ozone. We heard again on Monday, I think it was, about the increases in wetland in a warmer climate, and particularly with more CO2. This is robust across again across the models we looked at. However, it's not possible to distinguish whether this is caused by certainly in the experiments I looked at, as to whether this is caused by an increase in temperature or increase in the soil carbon due to the higher CO2. There are part of C4MIP some experiments that break that down, but we didn't look at that. However, this would give a large positive feedback. So that was looking at emissions. If we now look at the changes in chemistry, so a warmer climate tends to increase ozone removal in the troposphere. But because CO2 cools the stratosphere, it actually leads to more ozone in the stratosphere. But overall, we get quite a large negative feedback because we've reduced more ozone in a warmer climate. There's also, again, an effect on methane. So I've mentioned methane a few times. Of course, none of these crescendo models running in for CMIP6 included included interactive methane. Hopefully you all saw Gerd's talk earlier this week that showed that the newest generation of models do include that. But so any changes to methane emissions or methane lifetime won't affect the climate's feedback as seen in the current generation of models. But we can actually calculate analytically what that effect would be, how changes in methane lifetime and emissions would affect the climate sensitivity if we did allow them to interact in a model. So we can bring all this together now. So here I've shown, well, we'll start off here. So we can combine the changes in emissions per change in temperature. So we can get a sensitivity in teragrams of emission per Kelvin. And then we already have got the forcing. We know the forcing from changing emissions, watts per meter squared per teragram. So we just multiply these together, and that gives us our feedback factor in watts per meter squared per Kelvin. So this is what I've done here for all the different feedback processes. So, and I've colored the ones involving methane in red and the ones not involving methane in blue.
2 minutes.
So we can see that there's some large negative feedbacks from sea salt, from BVOCs, and from ozone. So these first two are because we've increased the amount of sea salt and BVOCs, and the last one's because we've decreased the amount of ozone. If we were to add up all the blue bars, that would give us actually quite a strong total non-CO2 feedback of about minus 0.2 watts per meter squared. However, if we include the methane feedbacks, they tend on the whole to be positive, particularly dominated by an increase in wetland methane, and that would offset a lot of this. So if you think about what you might see in the models that we run, then that would be negative. But if you account for methane, that And just to sort of give you an order of the ballpark numbers, we've got about minus 0.2 here, and typical physical processes are of the order, for instance, albedo and cloud 0.3, water vapor feedback is a lot larger. So to conclude, overall, the CRESCENDO models have negative contribution to their climate feedbacks from chemistry and aerosols, particularly that's assuming that they prescribe methane. And so the like to evolve interactively, as we saw from Gerd and also other talks this week, then you would actually have a negative feedback. So that's my conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. There are questions from Colin, and he says, sorry to ask about the one you don't have results for. What size would we guess permafrost thaw to produce?
I don't have an answer to the top of my head, and also what I've sort of assumed in these feedbacks is that they're more or less rapid. Of course, a permafrost is going to happen on a much longer timescale than other these feedbacks, so it's difficult to put it quite in the same framework.
Okay. And then wildfires would be another missing one.
It would, and so certainly UKSM is now putting wildfires in, but these weren't ready in time for the CMIP6. But absolutely, that would definitely be the next thing I'd like to look at. Would be how do wildfires change and what do they do to climate feedback? I would expect them to be negative from an aerosol point of view as well, although maybe from a CO2 point of view they wouldn't be.
Okay, thank you. Then we have to move on. Next one up is Josué Bock, and he's talking about evaluation of ocean dimethylsulfide concentrations. Yeah, can you go in full screen mode?
Yeah, I'm trying to. Okay, here we are.
No, we still see the preview.
I think it should start.
Okay. You might need to stop sharing and share again, I think, because I don't.
Is it okay?
No, still the preview.
Maybe you can maximize the size of what you've got.
Yeah.
Maybe run with that, because I don't have a copy, I don't think.
Yeah, that's
okay.
better. Yeah, that's better.
Okay, sorry. So hi to everyone. I'm presenting the results of the work about evaluation of ocean DMS concentration and emission in CMIP6 models. So in this presentation, there will be two major parts. The first part about present-day evaluation of models and comparison to existing climatologies. And the second part regarding scenario evolutions of DMS concentration and flux, both on a global scale and on a regional scale, especially Arctic and high latitude in general. So first, I'm presenting the evaluated models. So 4 CMIP6 models CNRM, MIROC, NOR ESM2, and UK ESM. In this table on the right column, you can see that the 4 models are using very different ways to diagnose the DMS concentration, either with prognostic models or with diagnostic and simplified parameterization of DMS concentrations. Now, regarding the climatologies that I used to compare with the models, so there is a widely used climatology of Lana et al. 2011, which uses DMS concentration data, which are interpolated and extrapolated to get a global coverage. In this study, I also used 2 other data sets. The one that I named J18, which is from the study of Marty Galli, published in 2018, which derived from satellite observation of chlorophyll and other variables, and which uses a remote sensing algorithm to derive the DMS concentration. And I also use a very recent publication from Wang in 2020, which uses the same in situ DMS concentration data with an artificial neural network to derive the concentration in places where there is no measurements. So I first present a global overview of the present day mean annual concentration on these maps. So as you can see on the 3 last panels, it's climatologies. So of Lana et al. Here, Galli and Wang. So already you can see that the climatology are not very consistent, the one with the other. And the upper 4 panels shows the results of the 4 evaluating models. There is also a 5th panel which shows the multi-model mean average of the SMHI models. So this can also be summarized in a very brief table showing the median and mean concentration in models and in climatologies. So as you can see, there is a wide range of values with nearly, so between the lowest value for Galli climatology and the highest one in Lana climatology, there is as much as 40% difference in DMS concentration. So in order to provide a more in-depth evaluation of models, I use different metrics. So on each line, there is a correlation coefficient, the bias, and the root mean square error of the models, as compared on the first row with Lana climatology, second row with Galli's climatology, and last row with Wang climatology. I won't go much into details to explain this figure. What I want to show here is that there is no, not really one single model performing better than the other. They all have some better results sometimes and less good results in other months, because it's a monthly comparison, but there is not a single model performing better than the other. So that's already a first interesting message, that all models can do better or worse depending on the time of the year. The second very interesting result that I got in present day condition is evaluating all 4 models in biogeographical regions. So it's a very common way to split the global ocean into 54 biogeochemical provinces which have similar conditions. And then in this table, you can see the correlation coefficient of yearly pattern for each model in each of these provinces, ocean provinces. And you can see on the column that they are ordered depending on the kind of biome. So you have polar polar Arctic on top and Antarctic here in blue, westerly provinces in green, and then trade wind provinces and coastal provinces. And this table shows that globally all models perform rather well in medium to high latitude provinces, so westerlies and polar, while they are doing much worse in trade wind provinces. And regarding coastal provinces, it depends whether they are rather high latitude coastal provinces or low latitude coastal provinces. And for low latitude coastal provinces, the model generally perform worse, and high latitude coastal provinces, the model perform generally better. So that's an interesting result to see that models, whatever the model, they generally perform better in mid to high latitude. Now I'm going to the scenario evolution to compare the trends of the models. So I use SSP 585 scenarios. And as you can see on these plots, there is a time series of global concentration and time series of global flux. So the striking result is that models disagree regarding the trends, whether it's an increasing trends of concentration and flux or a decreasing trends for two other models.
2 minutes.
So I will skip that. So there is in this study, I also focused on the Arctic case, which is a place where model provide a consistent representation of an increasing concentration and flux of DMS, which is related to the increase in ice-free extent. So I will just go to the takeaway messages of this presentation. So as I shown, there are large differences in model simulation, but also in climatologies of DMS. In the present day, there is no significantly better model as the other, and the models generally perform better in mid to high latitude biomes. Regarding the scenario evolutions, the model disagree on the sign of the DMS trend, but, and that's an important result, they agree that the flux of DMS has the same sign as the trend in concentration. And another important result is that all models agree on an increase in DMS in the Arctic and more generally in high latitudes regions. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat. Oh, sorry. And the question is from Yves Balkanski, and he's asking if you have looked at whether the models had a better performance where the density of measurements increased.
No. I did not. I use the global climatologies, which derived measurements, which indeed can have different concentrations, but I didn't check whether the models perform better where there are many measurements or where the measurements are much scarce.
Yeah, There's a second question from Colin, and he's asking, is there any hope to say which of the observational products is more reliable? They're so different. I agree. Is there any way to say, or not really?
I can't answer this question. My study is not really giving an answer to this question, actually.
Yeah.
Indeed, there are important differences which can be explained by obviously the different methods to reach the climatology. I mean, it's really yes, different methods to get them. But it's not really possible. Well, I wouldn't give an answer whether if there is a better climatology or not.
Yeah, okay. It's a pity. All right, we move on to the next talk. Thanks a lot. Which is by Gillian Thornhill and about radiative forcing to driving emissions. Floor is yours.
So I'm trying to get it. There we go. Is that?
Yeah,
that's all
looks good.
And everything. Okay, good. So I'm going to be talking about work we did to attribute radiative forcing to driving emissions in crescendo Earth system models, and actually some non-crescendo Earth system models, I should admit. There's a large number of collaborators for this work, the modelers, some of the people listed there below. We have the paper out in ACP, which I'll have more detail than I'll be able to get to in this talk. So just as a quick background, there's multiple definitions of radiative forcing, which started with simple radiative transfer calculations with one simulation in A here. I don't know if you can see the cursor. And gradually definitions changed, allowing the atmosphere to respond to the forcing agent. We are using definition D in the stuff I'm going to be talking about today, which is taking the difference between two full atmospheric model simulations, but having the ocean conditions prescribed for both of them. So it allows the atmosphere to change, so you can get atmospheric adjustments, but not the ocean. The land surface temperature can, however, change in this. There's another definition that people are beginning to use, which actually tries to restrict the land surface temperature. So this was done with the AirChem MIP experiments from CMIP6. It's a set of time slice experiments over 30-year runs. As I'm sure you know, control run with 1850 pre-industrial emissions and concentrations for the gases and aerosols of interest, and then a perturbed run with whichever gas or aerosol set to present day emission or concentration, and then taking the ERF as the difference between the net TOA radiative flux. We took perturbed minus control. So the main headline results for this, for the aerosols, we have black carbon, organic carbon, SO2. A couple of the models also did NH3. The air at the end is the combination of the other components for the aerosol, so it's sort of a combined aerosol run. And the multi-model means are the green bars at the end of each of those little sections with standard deviation error bar. And our multi-model mean ERF here gave us minus 1.01 watts per square meter for the ERF and the combined aerosols, which actually combines quite well with Bellowan et al. From their 2019 paper. we had a similar range from minus 0.63 to minus 1.47 watts per square meter. We do see, not surprisingly, model differences, particularly black carbon was interesting because some models included deposition on snow. I think MRI and NORI-SM had ice nucleation and clouds from black carbon as well. MIROC 6 had a negative ERF for black carbon, which was due to actually a very large negative cloud adjustment. We also see differences in the ERS for SO2 are largely due to cloud adjustments. We did radiative kernel analysis to break down the atmospheric adjustments and see what their contribution to ERF was. When we looked at the ERF for the chemically reactive gases, again, we have quite a lot of model variability for the different gases for the models here. In general, that's clearly due to how much of how complex the chemistry models were for each of the models. So I think CNRM had stratospheric ozone chemistry, but had ozone prescribed below 560 hectopascals. BCC only had tropospheric chemistry and not stratospheric chemistry. So a lot of the model variability is down to how the models treated those reactive greenhouse gases. And there's a lot more detail on this in the paper. The other thing we did was trying to decompose how what parts of the ERF were due to aerosol cloud interactions versus aerosol radiation interactions. And GAN in 2013 came up with a methodology for breaking that down. So where in the models you get radiative fluxes calculated for all sky and clear sky from the radiative transfer models, some of the models had a second set of calculations where they did the same thing, but removing the effect of the aerosols basically from the radiative transfer. So you still have the other effects of the aerosols, but you have a sort of aerosol-free radiative flux calculation, and you can combine those as you can see in these little equations here on the right to get your ERF ARI, which is radiation, ERF ACI for cloud, and in the case of the aerosols, you get the ERF due to albedo changes. So for the models that we had results for this, we can see in both the combined aerosol and the SO2, it's the aerosol cloud interactions that are dominating, not surprisingly. Interestingly, I think we see, I should explain, sorry, the blue bars are the aerosol radiation, gray is aerosol cloud, and the orange is the albedo. And for example, in black carbon for NORI-SM and the MRI, we get more of a signal here from the albedo changes than we do in the other two models. So if we then have a look at those in terms of looking at the maps, remembering that in the top left, this aerosol is the combination of these other three aerosols basically combined in the model run for the aerosol here. So we have CNRM, NORI-SM, UK ESM and MRI in each of these panels. So we can see, for example, that in UK ESM, there's a very strong signal from the black carbon, a very strong positive ERF here. And when we look at the combined aerosol, that shows up quite clearly in Africa and up in Asia and so on. Similarly, where you've got a strong positive signal from the black carbon for NORI-SM in Africa, that's showing up over here as well. And I think it's in UK ESM, again, the organic carbon, they have a stronger negative signal here than the other models. because I think the organic carbon in UK ESM is non-absorbing. When we look at the maps here for the aerosol cloud interactions, we can get some similar sense of how the different aerosols in the different models are combining to give that overall aerosol ERF. It should be noted that it's not a linear addition because when you combine all the aerosols in this sort of combination experiment, because the cloud droplet numbers, it's not a linear process, so the SO2 might begin to dominate and saturate the cloud droplet numbers, affecting the ACI, and you will then not see such a strong signal necessarily from the black carbon and the organic carbon. There's a couple of things of interest here, which I haven't had time to investigate, is for the organic carbon we see in NOR-ESM and MRI, a strong positive signal here over Alaska. In the other areas we see there's a strong positive signal from black carbon in UK ESM there, but it doesn't show up when we've got the combination because the SO2 is actually drowning that out completely. So unfortunately, I haven't had time to get into a deep analysis of this, but this at least gives us some kind of a breakdown when we're looking at what that overall aerosol ERF is due to. We can actually then start to have a look at the aerosol cloud interaction and the aerosol radiation interaction. We did do some work on radiative kernels, like I said, but I don't have time to get into that now, but it is in the paper. So in a brief summary, this is looking at the multi-model variability and clearly differences in the treatment of aerosol cloud interactions and deposition and characteristics of the aerosols in the different models. The reactive gas ERS, there's the model complexity and the chemistry and what's included in that. And for this, we use the double calls with aerosol-free radiation to give us a chance to break down the ERF. And like I said, the paper has much more of the detail in this. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any questions in the chat. Okay. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, maybe have an eye on the chat and maybe they come up later. And unfortunately, I don't have one myself either.
That's fine.
So, hold on. Did all models have the same pre-industrial conditions? Eve Bolkonski is asking.
I think they did, yes.
Okay.
In terms of the emissions and concentrations, they were supposed to all be the same.
Okay. Good. All right. Then we move on to Jöran März. And he's talking about the oceanic biological carbon pump.
Yeah.
Floor is yours.
Do you see full screen at the moment?
Yes. Yeah, looks good.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to give this presentation on my work. It's a collaborative work within the CRESCENDO project, but also with colleagues from the Planck Institute for Marine Microbiology in Bremen. And we aimed basically at advancing the representation of the biological carbon pump in HAMOCC. Andrew Yole yesterday gave already a nice overview on how CMIP6 models show deep sequestration of particulate organic carbon fluxes and how that pattern happens in CMIP6 models. And this is clearly linked to how we represent POC fluxes. And looking at different formulations, currently we have in the HAMOCC model the standard Martin curve representation with a globally fixed value basically. Then other models have POC fractions, which are low or fast sinking, or there's an aggregation scheme for purely POC in the PISCUS or NOR-ESR model, or there are some ballasting schemes following the Armstrong et al. Approach. And with our new model approach, we want to explicitly represent marine aggregates with a microstructure and also in a mechanistic way, and including ballasting effects. Looking at aggregate composition in microstructure, we see that marine aggregates feature a really heterogeneous composition of different size and density. So the primary particles that make up the composition of marine aggregates, they at the end affect the excess density and porosity of aggregates, and that eventually determines the settling velocity and then the POC transfer efficiency. Yeah, as you know, aggregates feature high sinking velocities ranging from a meter per day up to more than 200 meters per day. So how do we represent now these marine aggregates in the HAMOCC? The Margot model core, I would call it, represents the heterogeneous aggregate structure and composition via our sinking HAMOCC tracers, which are POC, calcium carbonate, silicate, and dust, which then are combined basically in a fractal representation for the marine aggregate microstructure. And so basically, yeah, recombining them via primary particles. In a whole schematic way, the HAMOCC tracers determine then the fractal dimension via stickiness or like attributed properties of the primary particles, like the stickiness, density, and size, and they basically then determine fractal dimension and the mean primary particle size and density. And so we also represent the number aggregate number distribution and its slope, and that eventually determines the mean sinking velocity with which all tracers that are settling then sink. So by that, the Margot scheme captures relevant aggregate properties, explicitly representing size, microstructure, porosity, excess density in HAMOCC, and implicitly represents the aggregation and remineralization dependent fragmentation of aggregates, and includes, well, we also had to include the temperature and oxygen dependent remineralization basically. We did that under climatological conditions, in this case here, and we were able to improve by that the POC transfer efficiency pattern on a global scale. As you can see on the left-hand side, the standard HAMOCC was a globally more or less uniform, apart from the oxygen minimum zones, more or less uniform transfer efficiency pattern. Then in the middle, the more or less recent pattern, yeah, based on observations, and then the inverse modeling strategies. And on the right-hand side, then our new model approach with Margot. As you know, the transfer efficiency is a measure of how efficient basically POC can become sequestered. And so this pattern was heavily temperature and oxygen dependent, or dependent on the remineralization, which is a strong driver for the transfer efficiency pattern. And on the other hand, spatial temporal variability sinking velocity also contributes to the latitudinal transfer efficiency pattern. Due to our explicit representation of the marine aggregates, it allowed us to dive a little bit deeper into the driving factors for settling velocity. And on the left upper side, we see the basically the relative contributions of the driver to the mean settling velocity. Here is a primary particle density, and then the primary particle size, microstructure as represented by the fractal dimension, then the viscosity, maximum aggregate size, and the number distribution slope B. And as you can see, the pattern is primarily driven by the primary particle density and primary particle size, basically, and potentially by the microstructure, where I guess quite some uncertainty exists. putting that MARGO scheme now in extending the CMIP6 standard HAMOCC version with this MARGO scheme. We were running a transient and historical run under the SSP 585 scenario, and what we see is that the MARGO scheme with its temperature-dependent reminalization increases net primary production, particularly in the equatorial regions compared to the standard HAMOCC, and also in general increased the net primary production on a global scale. If you look at percentage changes, the MARGO scheme slightly reduced the percentage-wise decrease of net primary production in the equatorial regions, and weakens net primary production's increase in the Arctic region, which is defined as north of 66 degrees. So we see when we look at the transfer efficiency pattern under the future scenario, we see the strongest regional changes associated to changes in oxygen minimum zones, and also see some significant reduction in the Arctic Ocean by the end of the century, basically. While particularly in the Arctic Ocean, it's still higher than in the standard HAMOCC, which also explains the change in the net primary production in the Arctic regions. When we look at the RC CO2 fluxes under the SSP 585 scenario, the most strongest changes are basically linked, like show up in the high latitudes, particularly in the Southern Ocean. While on the other side, the global CO2 fluxes in MARGO remain within the standard HAMOCC ensemble spread.
2 minutes.
Yes, thank you. I guess I'm a little bit fast. Sorry for that. So to conclude, with MARGO, we were able to improve the representation of the POC transfer efficiency pattern. Then MARGO imprints on the latitudinal CO2 uptake pattern, and we were able to bridge the gap from microscale marine aggregate properties in spatially temporally variable environments to global impacts on POC and RC CO2 fluxes. In general, MARGO provides a link between phytoplankton community and size structure and POC fluxes. And by explicitly representing marine aggregates in HAMOCC, it enables to represent aggregate properties related processes like size-dependent remineralization processes. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your presentation. There is a question from Andrew Yule. Now my chat disappeared. What drives disaggregation in your particles? Turbulent mixing, or is there a biological component?
I mean, fragmentation, it's basically driven by remineralization, whatever that is in our case. So basically it's a microbial fragment or remineralization, and that then introduces a reduced stickiness of the inside the aggregates, which leads to fragmentation, which is implicitly represented in our cases.
And he's got a second question, which is, are the improvements you've shown in transfer efficiency matched in interior fields like DIC and oxygen?
In oxygen, I can say for particularly in the Southern Ocean, yes, while there are quite some uncertainty, I would say. And in general, on a global scale, I would say there were some improvements and some non-improvements, basically worsening things. So it kept a balanced nutrient distribution, I would say.
Okay, and then there's another question from Christoph Heinze. Did you compare the modeled particle fluxes with sediment trap data? An adventure.
Yes, we did. I mean, it's not done with the ESM run, but we did it with the climatological run, basically, which we did in the 2020 paper in Biogeosciences, and
right.
did fairly well, I would say.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Colin Jones still has a few last words and the presentation prepared for us to end this.
Right, thanks.
Please, Colin.
Thanks, Ruth. I'll try and share my screen. Can you see me all right? Because I'm on a computer I'm borrowing.
We can see you, yes.
Oh, okay, right. I can't see myself. And that's now full screen, yeah?
Yes, now it's full screen. Yes.
Okay, I'll keep my own time and I'll try and be brief. So many thanks for the conference to begin with. And if I do forget, I've got thanks to say at the end, but if I do forget, I'm going to say right away. Many thanks to Hazel for arranging everything and ensuring everything ran so smoothly, because everything ran incredibly smoothly, and that is totally down to Hazel and not down to me at all. So many thanks to her at the outset. What I'm going to do is run through a little bit some of the highlights of the project and try and do it quickly. Some of the things have already been shown, and I'm just going to remind you of a few of the things that we did in the last 5 years now. So first, thank you to Chris and maybe some others. So a parcel did arrive yesterday and I opened it, but I haven't opened the bottle. So you may be able to see it's a bottle of Dartmoor whiskey, and you can possibly see one of the glasses. It says Crescendo, probably the best ESMs in the world, with due nod to a Danish lager. So many thanks for that. I shall open it later. Right, I just wanted to start with a few pictures, and I'm going to go, I want to have a pointer. So just to remind you of things, so we spent time together, you will probably recall, in a former life, where we sat in rooms and actually listened to conferences. Early on, we learned from Asher and people at UEA about how to communicate in science. We visited the COP event twice. So I don't know if you can see that picture, but some of us there are trying to look interested and some of us are failing to look interested at COP. We visited the EU Parliament and gave some sessions at the EU Parliament, and we got to schmooze around with parliamentarians and drink their wine. We did a lot of outreach. We had a really good group from Albania that produced a video that you might remember about the Earth being sick, and they won a competition that we weren't allowed to call a competition. And we sent them to a Climate Europe event in Belgrade as a reward, and that's a picture of them there. We did some dissemination, so I had the pleasure of taking my own team, UKSM team, to the Royal Society in London for a week in 2017, and we had a great time telling people about climate change, and we were representing Crescendo as well. And of course, I've got this picture in the middle because we met lots of times, and I just want to highlight that, of course, we lost one of our closest friends during this project. A lot of you will remember Alex Lerv here, who was a fantastic friend to many of us, and unfortunately passed away in 2018. And I'm sure all your thoughts go to Alex and his family. Okay, just carrying on into words. So Crescendo in words, and I apologize if I've missed anything here. We improved 7 Earth system models. We produced forcing data for CMIP6. That might seem a long time ago, but we were producing integrated assessment model scenario at forcing data 3 years ago. We contributed or led many of the scientific and technical developments for various MIPs. I've listed those ones that we were heavily involved in here. And of course, we realized simulations for them. We've got most of the data on the ESGF, I would say by now. There's probably still some scarce data to get there, but most of it's there. There are numerous papers appearing on our own simulations and other people's simulations for CMIP6. Of course, we heard about the Porsche version of ESM Valtool. That's been developed, released and documented, and will continue living long after the project. One thing I'm going to highlight briefly is we did a large number of policy and public dissemination events. We developed different apps for communicating information. We wrote policy briefs. We made some videos. We had some school visits, and you may remember we even had a play made or a musical. At present, there's over 300 peer-reviewed publications from Crescendo, and probably most importantly, we've got some good memories. We made some old friendships, and we've made some new ones as well that I think will keep going. So I asked each of the work package leaders to give me a quick taster. So some of this you've heard before, but I'm going to whip through it. I'm going to keep my own time so you can listen or not listen as you see fit. And I hope there's someone there by the end. These are all mixed up. I'm going to start with the dissemination because that didn't get a lot of play in the conference, but it had an awful lot of play during the project and was greatly appreciated both by the groups that were involved and by the EU. So there were videos made, as I said. The Albanian team in an Albanian school made a fantastic video about the Earth being sickling and how to cure it. You may remember, I'm sure, back in the Paris General Assembly in 2017, seems like a lifetime ago now. We had a musical made by École Janine Manuel that was absolutely fantastic, setting 2100, and they performed it for us at the GA, and they came to dinner with us afterwards. In SMHI, they've had a continuous engagement with some Swedish schools, working on projects, working on infographics, how to communicate climate change to people of their own age group. And they did a fair amount of gaming as well around climate change. So the dissemination has been a big success in the project. We developed some apps. So at UEA, they developed an app to be able to easily look at our climate change information. So you can look at it on web browsers, but you can look at it on your telephone as well. UEA also developed the science brief, which is something where you can easily, either the public or scientists can go and get a short and quick review of high-profile papers, and I think that's something again that will live well beyond Crescendo. And then jumping into some of the science now, so of course the Earth System Model Evaluation Tool we've heard about a lot. This has been a fantastic development that started before Crescendo and will live long after Crescendo. And DLR and the other teams deserve enormous amount of credit for the tool, and particularly its use, I think, in AL6. Okay, jumping around a bit. So work package 14, one of the highlights from that, from Stefan, was a meeting we had in the summer of 2019 where we could physically meet again. We talked about how to recommend models for ICIMIP, which is the intermodal impact model into comparison project. A result of that was that 5 core models were recommended, 3 were Crescendo models, and I believe there were a secondary set of models in which some of the other Crescendo models were there as well. A couple of other outlines, a bias correction procedure that was developed by Stefan got applied to the CMIP6 models and also got applied to ERA5 reanalysis as an evaluation tool and as something to drive the models with. So that was a great success. Another example of meetings, work package, let's see, this is 8, I think. They chose a meeting they had in Aspen, a nice sunny place. They were preparing, I think, for the problems we have now with meeting by having it in a tent. So it was well ventilated. And of course, they chose a nice location rather than going to somewhere like Reading or Exeter. Aspen's a good choice. And it was about model evaluation and emergent constraints. And it led to a lot of both papers and I think a lot of collaborations that are still developing work today. Work package 10, which was the one about the integrated assessment models. They worked primarily in the first half of the project. But it was critical work. They developed the SSP forcing for the SNORMIP papers, for the SNORMIP simulations, and also were involved in generating the data for the historical simulations. So without that work, most of our ESM work would not have been possible thereafter. So many thanks to them as well. Work package 12 was about ScenarioMIP. So we all realized the ScenarioMIP simulations after a lot of pulling our hair out to get the forcing data ready. And 2 of the highlights, of course, were, as we've heard many times, CMIP6 is warmer than CMIP5 because some of the models have a higher climate sensitivity, our own being one of those. And as Klaus talked about, the radiative forcing in CMIP6 seems to be slightly higher than the equivalent RCPs in CMIP5. Work package 9 you already heard about today from Gillian and from Bill, which was a thorough investigation of the radiative forcing and the feedbacks involving aerosols and chemistry. And I think there's a lot of work to carry on in those areas. And of course, it's opened up other aspects, such as things like the permafrost that I brought up, or wildfires, where there's plenty more work to be done in that area. But I think Crescendo has really pushed the barriers forward there and pointed to areas to go forward in the future. This was shown by Fiona or Eve, I don't remember, that might have been Eve that's shown it. Originally, Fiona sent me the topic was demonstrable improvement in a long-standing bias. Eve corrected that to be modification. So you can make your choice, but it's interesting to see that if you represent better mineralogy from Sahelian dust, you get an impact on precipitation, both over the Sahelian region and potentially downstream over the South American region as well. So that was fascinating to see. Laurent sent me an example of work package 2, which was on ocean biogeochemistry, emphasizing that the project has helped to further develop the biological pump in a number of the ESMs, IPSL, CMCC, NOR-ESM, Max Planck model and IPSL. Again, he didn't mention UKSM one, but we had a good inverted biological pump as well, I think. Oh, Andrew would say we did. Work package 1 did a lot of work on the terrestrial carbon cycle and the representation of nitrogen in particular, which was a major development from CRESCENDO that pushed forward CMIP6 models. They also did a lot of work to look at land use change, and this is an example from Lena Boyson's presentation, or Lena Boyson's paper, I should say, that I think Victor referred to, where they looked at idealized deforestation, saw things like cooling in the boreal region, and then models disagreeing on whether there was a warming or a cooling in tropical regions. And I think land use change, of course, is coming up more and more as a mitigation option as we go forwards. Looks like I'm going to be on time. Kat Scott sent me an example of work package 4. It was her own work. Well done, Kat. But in work package 4, it was about evaluating natural aerosols, BVOCs being one example, but there were many others. And work is ongoing there, I think, to try and understand the link between biology, aerosols, radiative forcing, both biology in the ocean and on land. Work package 5, Roland is very efficient, so he sent me 2 improvements or 2 highlights. One, the paper where they actually tracked the improvements from CMIP5 to CMIP6, and there were improvements in both the physical and in the biological components of the models, but there were also no improvements in some things, so there's work still to do should there be a CMIP7. And then one important development was that they had a coding school in February in Sweden that Klaus Zimmermann put together with Roland, where a number of biogeochemistry, marine biogeochemistry diagnostics were implemented into ESM-VAL tool. And I think prior to that coding workshop, there was very little coverage of marine biogeochemistry in ESM-VAL tool. So that was a big step forward, and many thanks to Klaus and Roland for pushing that forward. Work package 4, I just highlight some analysis on permafrost. Of course, this was evaluation of the terrestrial carbon cycle as well. So there was lots of evaluation of the C4MIP experiments and the role of nitrogen and the limitation role of nitrogen. But permafrost was an example that Sunka sent to me, and this was talked about by Eleanor earlier in the week. Okay, getting to the very end, so I've kept well within time. So just a few very small things. We still have to put the final report together, unfortunately, so that's a non-smiley face. That's due 2 months after the project finishes. But smiley face, once we've done that, and if the EU agree with it, then your institutes will get some more money out of the EU, so it's important we do it. So it's just a quick reminder to the work package leaders and the RT leaders that your work, unfortunately, has not finished with this final General Assembly. You have a little bit of work to do, and we will be badgering you about that in due course. But many thanks to everyone for your help, your enthusiasm, and most of all, I think your friendship over the past 5 years. It's been a real pleasure working with people. It's been a real pleasure when we could meet. It's a great pity that we can't meet now, but I'm sure we will be able to meet again in the future. And I'm sure we will be working together in the future without any doubt. Particular thanks to the RT and the work package leads who've had to deliver to the requests of Hazel, Alberto, and myself over the past 5 years. And many thanks to the advisory board, to Bill, Claire, and Denise. I did notice Claire and Denise were online a little bit earlier, so if they are still online, many thanks to you. Bill is probably not online because it's the middle of the night, I guess, in Colorado. And then a particular thanks to Hazel, who's the project manager now, and of course to Alberto Munoz, who was the project manager for the first 3.5 years of the project. Largely, they ran the show, and I just did what they told me to do. And I think that works out quite well when it's done like that. So if you've got an efficient project manager as a project coordinator, you don't need to do a great deal. So an enormous amount of thanks to both of those. And last of all, I just hope that we are able to meet again soon in a bar near someone at some time. So hopefully by the end of the year, some of us will be physically meeting and saying hello to each other. And I'm done now.